So it's my pleasure now to introduce Bob Cusack, the editor-in-chief of The Hill, who will moderate a panel on how will candidates' messages and platforms change with the popular vote. Bob.
Thanks, Jim. I want to introduce our panel. Norm Ornstein of AEI, Michael Steele, former chair of the RNC, Brianna Carmen of Voto, Latino, and Jesse Wegman of New York Times editorial board. I was looking back at the states that were visited most by Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in the last election. Not surprisingly, it was Ohio, North Carolina, Florida, Pennsylvania. Of course, Democrats wish that Hillary Clinton had visited Wisconsin a bit more. But the first question would be, if we did change the system, and Norm, I'll start with you, what would be the impact of campaigns and their strategy?
So, as you mentioned, Bob, they visited the large states. And I was kind of amused when Senator Kramer of North Dakota, defending the Electoral College, said, this would make North Dakota irrelevant. Well, guess what? When it comes to presidential politics, North Dakota is totally irrelevant right now. But let's say we had a presidential election that was looking awfully close in terms of popular votes. Then every vote would count, and candidates would have an incentive to try and maximize the turnout even in places like North Dakota. You know, one of the things when we dissected Hillary Clinton's loss, one of the things that kept coming up was not whether she visited Pennsylvania or Michigan, but that the analytics on the team said, go to the places where your votes are. And instead of going to places where she lost 80-20, where she might have moved it to 60-40 and made a difference, they ignored those areas. But if you're looking at a reality where the votes count, as they do within states, the smart thing to do is to go everywhere and make sure that you can get votes even in places and counties and states that you would lose. So I think what we would see is television ads in places like North Dakota, which of course are very cheap. You'd see a ground campaign, because if you're going to lose by, as Richard Nixon did in 1960, 1 vote per precinct, and you know that if you can shift 2 votes per precinct, you could win, you're going to go everywhere. So the paradox here is that the major defense of the Electoral College, that it gives clout to small states, is exactly wrong. Small states would have much more clout in the world we live in if we had a national popular vote.
Michael, you've been in the war rooms of campaigns. In presidential elections, I mean, other than the primaries, do states like North Dakota, are they even discussed?
No. They aren't. The fact of, no, they're not. Only to the extent, though, you do measure how much money you can get out of North Dakota, because it becomes a donor state. Like my home state of Maryland, if you're a Republican, you only come to Maryland if you want to have a fundraiser. You're not going to go there to campaign for the votes the way Norm laid out. And I think that's an important thing to understand. The way the system is designed through the Electoral College, what we have wound up doing, folks, is we're not holding elections in the United States of America. We're holding elections in the battleground states of America. So you're only talking in any given presidential cycle somewhere between 8 and 12 states that the presidential campaigns give a damn about, because the rest of it is just sideline. It's flyover or it's donor. You're not going to take the time, you're not going to spend the money, because you're going to concentrate on those winner-take-all states that you need as dictated to by the current political cycle, or other things that you look at and say, well, okay, Michigan in the last cycle would have been a battleground state had Hillary Clinton played effectively, but she sort of took it for granted, and Donald Trump didn't. And that actually kind of speaks to the nature of this particular effort. It does open up the prospects. It forces candidates to have to pay attention to every state, because every state becomes important. So if I'm running for president as a Republican, all of a sudden California is equally important to me as my home state of Maryland, or Florida, or Ohio. Why? Because I'm about turning my vote, getting my vote. Yeah, I may lose the vote in California, but that vote is now added to a bigger number that will help me in a national campaign. So we talk a lot about national races here in the United States, and this is a national campaign, national polling. At the end of the day, folks, they're only polling and really care about a handful of states. And if you're not in one of those states, you're not going to see the benefit of it. As my good friend Saul Anuzis, who was chairman of the Michigan party at the time of the 2008 cycle, Michigan was a big player until the McCain campaign decided to pull out. Right? And then because they made this conclusion, well, this is no longer relevant. Well, it was relevant to all the races that were taking place in Michigan at that time. And the impact of that premature removal from the race resulted in losses not just of the state by the presidential candidate, but down ballot as well. So you can see there are connections here beyond just the presidential, and why making, as Norm put out, the platform available to every voter to participate, everyone gets to play, and everyone up and down the system benefits from it.
Mm-hmm. Brianna, how would this, if we went to a national popular vote, how would it affect voter turnout? I've talked to a Republican in Maryland who literally said recently, my vote doesn't count in the presidential, but a lot of people feel that way. Would it help it significantly?
I absolutely believe that it would. So we see that one of the key reasons why people don't turn out to vote is because they feel like their vote doesn't matter. It's this apathy that continues to grow, so that way you as an individual, you're not turning out, campaigns aren't reaching out to you, and it's a vicious cycle that continues. I think Virginia is a good example of how we can correct this, where in 2000, Virginia was solidly Republican, so no one went out to it, no one really hosted any events there. Well, flash forward to 2016, Virginia is a contested state, so you saw 23 presidential events there, and that means that individuals in Virginia ended up turning out more in states that were, traditionally considered safe. So you had about 66% turnout in Virginia, up from 2000, whereas states like Texas, where they're traditionally considered safe and you don't host events, you saw voter turnout around 50%. So you know that people, when they feel like their vote matters, they would actually turn out, and the national popular vote would really contribute to that.
Just to follow up on that, though, the critics say, well, then the candidates would just go to the big cities.
Right. So I think it is definitely an increase from what we see now, because candidates, they completely ignore 40 or so states right now. They're just solely focusing on 10 battleground states like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. And if we switch to the national popular vote, you would actually have to reach out to more individuals in more diverse areas. So you would be reaching more of the mass, because the current system actually forgoes about 80% of the electorate.
Jesse, you have a book that's coming out in the spring on this. What did you learn? What did you hear from people on this topic?
So it's interesting, the book looks at the history of the Electoral College and efforts to change it over the years, but I end with a chapter on talking to campaign managers and field directors from the last 20 or so years from both Republicans and Democratic campaigns. And what was fascinating to me was almost to a person, they all wanted a national popular vote.
Both sides.
Yeah, both sides. There were a couple of exceptions, which you can buy the book to find out about. But the vast majority of them understood how much this warps American democracy. And I think one of the things that's interesting to me is in the previous panel, Professor Wong was talking about this risk of the 1 in 3 risk that a person who wins the popular vote nationally doesn't become president. And it struck me. I was like, why are we calling that a risk? If the Electoral College's defenders are right, and this is a system that is there for a good reason, and it was put there by the framers of the Constitution, and it's been with us for more than 2 centuries, then why is that a risk? What's the problem with having a popular vote winner not be president? I think the answer is pretty obvious, which is that nobody feels that that is a legitimate way to elect a president. Republicans don't feel it if it could happen to them, and Democrats certainly haven't felt it when it's happened to them. And so what you find is that campaigns, they understand this. They don't want to campaign in battleground states only. They do it because it's politically smart. Right. They know how to spend. They have limited time. They have limited money, and they're not stupid. They know they got to spend it in ways that maximize their chance of winning under the system that we have right now. In contrast, if you had this popular vote, you would have a system in which, as all the other panelists have been saying, candidates would suddenly be freed to go to the places where the votes were. And that doesn't just mean big cities. I think one of the interesting pieces of research that I've seen lately comes from the National Popular Vote team. These are the people who are running the compact, this interstate compact that's been gaining steam over the last few years. And it actually uses what happens in battleground states right now as a proxy for a national popular vote. We're all speculating on how would a national popular vote election run. There's a pretty good answer to that, which is we can see it right now happening in battleground states. Battleground states are elections in which every single vote counts the same, and the person who gets the most votes wins, right? That's what a national popular vote is. So you look at how do campaigns actually run their elections in battleground states. They go everywhere. They go across the state. Every campaign manager I spoke to said this to me. They said, this is just campaigning 101. You don't just live in the cities. You go everywhere. If there's 30% of the population lives in urban areas, you spend about 30% of your time there. If 25% of the people live in rural areas, you spend 25% of your time there. It happens again and again, and you see it in every battleground state. I think that's a pretty good illustration of what we would see with a popular vote election.
There's another, I think, important area to consider here. It's not just where you would go and spend the dollars, it's how you would campaign. In our tribalized, polarized time, there is no incentive to reach out to people on the other side. But if you are trying to get every vote, and we're talking about moving into the rural areas, Democrats would have an incentive to be more sensitive to the issues and the concerns of rural voters. They're going to change the rhetoric and very possibly change some policies. Michael talked about California. We now have a sort of national Republican campaign led by the president in a war against California, trying to undermine everything that California is doing. If you're out to get a sizable number of votes in California, you're not going to do that. So it isn't just about whether you're going to pay attention to the states by campaigning and putting in money. You're going to change the way you talk, and you're going to change your policies at a time when we desperately need those changes.
Michael, you're on TV all the time. How would the media, how would it change how the media covers campaign?
That's actually a very good question, because the media has various, I guess, stress tests that they go through to figure out where they want to send their people and which states they want to concentrate their time. Very much the way campaigns do. You're looking at the value added. Okay, am I going to spend time in North Dakota when the candidate's just going there to do a flyover or a donor event? The answer probably is going to be no, they're not. But if that candidate is actually going to go there and campaign and spend time, I think you would see is the media will have to adapt their strategies as well, because their goal ostensibly is to follow the candidates, right? And to report the news that they are making or not making. And so I think that you will see some change in how the on-ground reporters do their job and where they go and the decisions that their editors are going to be making in terms of their assignments and where they send them. This idea that you now open up all 50 states as a voter playground is a fascinating and important one, I think, if we really believe that the system should allow for everyone to vote and every vote to matter and every vote to count. You either believe that or you don't. This notion that candidates under a national popular vote would somehow concentrate their time in urban centers is just silly, because clearly the person who says that or think that has never run a campaign or been a candidate. You're not going to get votes. If 50% of your population that you're going after is in one place and you leave the other 50% to your competitors, what do you think is going to happen to you? You're not going to win, because that 50% of that vote that you're concentrated on is still split up, right? Between the other candidates who are running. You don't have the market. No candidate corners the market on every vote in a jurisdiction. That is why when you open this process up and you say to the voters, you're now in play, those candidates will take note of that. And the media has to follow that. They're going to follow the script. They're going to follow where the news lines are going to be taking them. And they're going to follow where the candidates begin to make some noise. So if you get a Republican candidate, sticking with the California example, who suddenly sees a bump in the numbers, and that, yes, they're behind, but they're competitive in California, you don't think the press is going to cover that story? They're going to say, well, it's California, he's going to lose it anyway. No, they're going to cover that story. And what happens? That then feeds the narrative downstream. It's very much the way the system is set up now. What do we anchor our presidential elections off? 2 friggin' states, Iowa and New Hampshire. You have people writing stories that if you don't win Iowa or New Hampshire, your campaign is over. Well, tell that to the candidates who are running in South Carolina and who are running in Nevada, who are running right now in places like California and Florida. So the idea is to open the process up a lot more, to engage the voters for sure, but also to bring those other components of the process, the media and the political system, in line with what the voters are doing.
Brianna, you travel the country and talk to voters and young voters in particular. What are you hearing on this issue, and which communities do you think are underrepresented the most?
So traditionally, it is communities of color and other marginalized groups that have been underrepresented in our electoral process. And these students of color feel it. They live in California, they think that their vote doesn't matter. They live in Texas, which has traditionally been considered a safe state. So having that in mind, you feel like these, sorry everyone, you definitely feel as if these candidates don't really represent your values. I think, much to what my co-panelists were saying, as far as candidates really focusing on battleground states, they focus on fringe voters in these battleground states that allow them to just capture a sliver of that margin, so that way they can win electoral votes in that state. Whereas if you actually care about the millions of people living in California and Texas as you would in a popular vote, you would actually have to change the narrative of your candidacy. You wouldn't be able to win on a racist, xenophobic agenda. You would actually have to care about the millions of voters that would contribute to your overall victory.
Jesse, we were talking about some history backstage about in 2000, which I remember at the time was amazing that there was no violence after that contested election. But there was, everyone thought maybe it would flip, that Gore would become president, but then Bush would actually win the popular vote, and we saw the flip of that. And then in 2004, it was very important for the Bush team to win the popular vote, which they did. So question is, do you think Donald Trump is going to focus on the national popular vote in 2020?
Well, it depends what day you ask him. I mean, Trump has said both that he has won the popular vote, that he would have won the popular vote if millions of illegal voters hadn't cast their ballots, and that he would win the popular vote if he campaigned differently. So I don't quite know what Donald Trump's position is on the popular vote today. I do think, going back to what Jim quoted at the beginning of this event, he tweeted, the Electoral College is a disaster for democracy on election night 2012. When he tweeted that, it was around 7 p.m., and the reason that he tweeted it is because it looked briefly, as the early returns were coming in, like Barack Obama was going to win the Electoral College and Mitt Romney could win the popular vote. All it takes is the hint that this might flip for people to get very upset about the system that we have right now. So I think what you're referring to with the 2000 and 2004 elections is also really instructive. There's reporting from before the 2000 election that election, as Bob just said, was looking like it might go the other way. There was a lot of reporting that there might be a split election in 2000 before the vote, but it was going to go the other way. People thought that George W. Bush would win the popular vote and lose the Electoral College. There's reporting that at least some people in George W. Bush's campaign were working on a strategy to essentially do what the Hamilton electors did in 2016, which is a public push, a sort of a PR blitz to get the electors to go with the popular vote winner and say the Electoral College is this anachronism from the 18th century, and what we need is a president who's been elected by all the people, right? Obviously, they didn't have to take that route, given how it turned out, but then 4 years later, because they had lost the popular vote, the Bush campaign team became perhaps the only campaign in American history that actively sought to win the popular vote. No other campaign probably ever has or ever should go for the popular vote as long as those aren't the rules. It would be politically crazy to do that. But the Bush team understood the issue of legitimacy that we've been talking about, and they understood how important it was for him to be seen as legitimate in the eyes of the country after what had happened in 2000. He ended up winning by 3 million votes, which is roughly Hillary Clinton's margin in 2016. So they managed it. Can I just make one
Sure,
other a point? This goes to what the other panelists have been saying. I think Norm and Michael were both referring to California, which I think is a great example. California, people know how many people voted for Donald Trump in California? It was 4.5 million people voted for Donald Trump in California. Not a single one of them mattered on election day, the real election day, which is December 19th when the electors cast their ballots, right? Because of the winner-take-all rule. The winner-take-all rule, which is what came up in the last session, is really at the heart of the inequity that's created by our current electoral college system. 4.5 million people is more than Hillary Clinton's entire national margin. None of those people counted. So I think it's really important to remember how many more people, and this is not from the perspective of campaigns, but from the perspective of turnout and involvement, how many more people would feel involved and would feel like they mattered under a popular vote regime. Brianna was mentioning the communities of color, where right now there's huge swaths of people who just don't count. Throughout the South, African American voters throughout the South haven't seen their vote, the vast majority haven't seen their vote represented by a single electoral vote in generations. All of a sudden you have a popular vote, and black voters in the South would matter just as much as white voters in Wyoming and in North Dakota and in West Virginia. So it just completely alters the calculus of how a campaign happens.
And to that point, which is really the heart of it, is when you're looking at it from a candidate's perspective, your entire engagement changes, because 4.5 million voters out of California are now added to a bigger number that you're trying to a goal you're trying to reach. So those voters on the ground have something, if you will, some skin in the game. We all know the frustration of West Coast voters. Elections are called just as they're getting off from work. And so their incentive is to go home and have dinner, right? Because anything after 5 o'clock doesn't matter. There's still another 3 hours worth of poll time going on, and a candidate wants those voters to turn out. But the voters are like, for what? You're not going to win my state. My vote doesn't count. It doesn't matter. I'm going to dinner, right? Now, all of a sudden, it's a different ball game. Now you've got a turnout machine from 5 to 8 p.m. in California if you're a candidate running, because all of a sudden now you've gotten the early return. You know what's coming, because you know how we get our returns at noon, we get our returns at 5. So we have a sense of what's going on here on the East Coast. The West Coast is a second thought if it's considered at all in most cases. I've talked to enough California legislators and candidates to know, particularly if they're Republican, what their day is like on an election day and what their turnout models are like. They kind of stop after 5 o'clock. So it really is a huge way to incentivize the voters and to re-engage the system in a way that we haven't ever. Because all of a sudden now, every vote is in play if I'm running. And I'm going to add that vote to the votes that I'm getting on the East Coast, to the votes I'm getting in the South, to the votes I'm getting in the Midwest. And I'm going to cobble together, like George Bush did, I'm going to cobble together my majority vote by tapping into every precinct and every voter in the country.
And that also affects congressional elections, too,
Absolutely.
because they're like, wait a minute, I need that voter who's going to go to dinner, who might have voted for me, but now is going to go to dinner.
So just to follow up on your question to Jesse, Donald Trump is the first president probably ever who has only focused on a base and reinforcing a base and not caring about the nation as a whole or trying even make a pretense to broaden that out, believing that the distortions of the Electoral College give him leverage. In 3 or 4 days, he's going to Minneapolis to do a rally. He's going into Ilhan Omar's district, and you know that it will be the rodent-infested kind of rhetoric that we've seen before. There are 2 goals here. One is to put Minnesota in play,
Which he nearly won.
which he came close to winning
right.
by appealing to the rural southern part of the state and the Iron Range. This is my home state, in fact. If we were looking at a national popular vote, I think the whole premise of his rhetoric and his policy would have to adjust if we assume that he's focused not just on making more money while he's president, but also on winning re-election. So you're going to be careful about what kind of rhetoric you use in Minnesota, because you may turn out even more of those voters who are appalled by that rhetoric. And to go back to California, we have these devastating forest fires, and Trump basically dismissed it, but also made sure that federal aid did not go to California. You're not going to do that if you're out to maximize your vote in California because you need it to compete for the national popular vote. So it changes an awful lot of the calculus of not just candidates, but a president, if you suddenly have to look at the world in a completely different way.
Right, and that brings up a really interesting perspective. So you're talking about Minnesota. We know that in 2016, Michigan and Pennsylvania were 2 of 3 top states that really helped solidify the candidacy for the president. And with that perspective in mind, we know that those states are, over 80% white. So individuals, if we switch to a national popular vote, would really have to change their narrative and how they go about courting diverse voters, so that way they are really appealing to the middle and the moderate, not just very extreme individuals who are representative of just one demographic.
Yeah, you mentioned something that I think is key to really appreciate and put into context, and that is the behavior not only of candidates, but certainly incumbent presidents when it comes to where they're going to put federal resources in a presidential campaign cycle. So during the Obama years, we had a hurricane that came into the Gulf, and the posture of the administration was one of, we're going to watch it, 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 and then it shifted to the western coast of Florida. It's like, damn it, we got to do something about this. We got to make sure there are resources available. Why? Because the battleground state of Florida was much more important in making sure that you let the people on the ground know we got your back and covered you than maybe the folks in Louisiana or elsewhere. So how these resources get allocated is also a factor. It's not just the vote per se, it's also the dollars, federal dollars, and how they're spent in presidential cycles by incumbents, and the promises that are made by candidates that are running to sort of let people know, I got your back, I'm with you. So whether it is federal aid on education, No Child Left Behind was a program out of the Bush years that was just,
Medicare Part D.
Yeah, Medicare Part D. Who was that for? Right? So you've got, you can begin to contextualize and understand exactly how all of it fits together. And then by undoing that system, this current system in a way that makes it more competitive, exposes the entire country to those very same resources and the very same level of scrutiny that candidates give a Florida or Ohio, an Iowa, whatever. I think you do a big service for the people of the country as a whole.
Can I add something to this? I think that's an excellent point, and I think we could go down the list of I mean, disaster declarations are particularly upsetting, right? Because this is, as someone I think said on the previous panel, this is a time when Americans are actually in need, and sometimes maybe their lives are in danger. So playing politics with that is particularly outrageous. But even just in the normal course of business, federal grants, presidentially controlled funding, and even in some cases legislation, which is it's a little harder to pin down because obviously there's a lot of different factors going into why any bill moves through and passes Congress. But the Medicare Part D example is one. You know, George W. Bush takes that up and gets it passed. You know, last I checked, Republicans weren't fans of massive government entitlement programs. But who does Medicare Part D help? It helps a lot of elderly people who need medicine and need access to affordable medicine. And where do those people live? A lot of them live in Florida. You know, both parties do this. This is not a Republican game. You know, what was one of President Obama's first major actions? To bail out the auto industry. Where's the auto industry? You know, the steel tariffs. You know, I mean, you can just go down the line and you really find a fascinating correlation, let's say. We won't immediately say causation, but a correlation between the kinds of decisions that presidents make with their money, with the money that they control, and where the battleground states are. This isn't to say that those aren't legitimate needs. This isn't to say that none of that matters. It's to say that the overbearing focus on those parts of the country is a distortion. It's a distortion of American democracy, and that if presidents looked at the nation as a whole and as a place that they needed to win support everywhere, the decisions about where money went would be more in line with what the nation needed as a whole.
Michael, you're a Republican. You're not a fan of the president. Do Republicans say to you privately, why do you support this? You know, we're not going to win the national popular vote, or we've won, this has happened 2 out of the last 5, and we've come out on the winning end, so stop talking about this.
No, you know, it's interesting. Not really. It is something that I think, in particular, when you look at recently, and certainly working with and being involved with the folks with National Popular Vote, and being in room with Republican legislators who are really, you know, conscientiously looking at this and considering it and weighing it and even taking up legislation in their chambers. Not just from, you know, a minority position, but, you know, the majority, being in the majority, because the smart one knows demographically and otherwise how the country's changing. We want to be competitive. We want to be able to win in places that we once won, like a California, certainly states in the West. And as you look at, you know, just in areas close to me, Virginia, which was a solidly red state, now is not. You've got to look at these realities and see, well, how do we, compete on this new battleground, if you will, that's being formed? So a lot of Republicans. I mean, you do have some who, you know, do the but for, you know, if we had this, you know, Bill Clinton would have been president, or, you know, whatever, Hillary Clinton would have been president. But that argument really doesn't stand up. I mean, folks aren't necessarily looking at it through such a narrow prism. And it surprised me because I thought they would at first, but that's not been my experience in my conversation with them. They see it as, you know, a way to sort of address what is coming changes in the country and you know, looking at the idea that, yeah, they would like everybody in their community to vote as well because that ultimately benefits them. I mean, it's the one thing that I've always said to Republicans when I was a county chairman, state chairman, national chairman, is never be afraid of the voter and never be afraid to put out the policies and the values and the positions that you believe in, because that's ultimately what they're going to gravitate towards. So all the machinations won't change the underlying requirement that you still have to talk to voters. You still have to make a case. And you can do what you want with gerrymandering, you can do what you want with voter suppression, you can do all these things, but at the end of the day, you still have to confront that voter. And I think a lot more Republican legislators, particularly at the state level, see that and, you know, are coming around to this idea of elevating this idea of a national popular vote.
So in 2012, after the Republican loss, Reince Priebuss, the chair of the Republican Party at the time, commissioned his famous autopsy. Quite a word to use for your party. It turns out in some ways to be a more accurate word. But remember that that was basically, oh my God, we're losing the demographic battle. We've got to change. We need to do something on immigration. Now, I think it was an inaccurate or an inadequate response in that autopsy. It was basically pass a comprehensive immigration bill and then we're fine. But it was Reince Priebuss who, as chief of staff to Donald Trump, ripped that autopsy up and threw it in the wastebasket, and they moved in a completely different direction. Imagine if you have to compete as a party for the national popular vote with a different set of circumstances where you're going to have to compete much more widely. You're not only going to push for a comprehensive immigration bill, but you're going to change the rhetoric you use about immigrants. You're going to have to look at a broader range of policies that you can change so that you can compete for minority votes. And it alters the landscape in far more ways than I think we've been thinking about. If you're going to compete as a national party, you're going to have to actually focus on solving problems for people in the country instead of inciting discord and division. So I think if we're looking at a panacea, and there is no panacea for what is an enormous cultural divide, and now something that's much worse, but if we're looking for something that can alter the landscape of our politics and our governance, this is where you start.
Right.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
And to really build off of what my two co-panelists have mentioned, we would actually see a policy agenda that is more reflective of our communities. So that way you're not just, again, focusing on extreme voters that would put you across the edge in Michigan and Pennsylvania. You would actually see real policy reform that focuses on the everyday citizen. You would see, more people caring about gun violence prevention, more people focusing on immigration, more people focusing on border security, or a way to stop separating our families, because that's what your base is made out of. You would actually have a larger base that you would have to cater to instead of just a few voters in a few states that aren't representative of the United States as a whole.
And I think what all of this points to is two things. One is the answer to those Republicans who say, oh well, we would lose a popular vote is, yes, if you continue down this path of this sort of racist, xenophobic, revanchist party, you will. You will. The country is changing, and you're aiming for a smaller and smaller slice of it. But as all of the fellow panelists are saying, that's not the only direction you can go in. And in fact, a popular vote forces parties into a broader, to approach a broader constituency. And I think that's really the key here, which is that the way that we select our presidents and the way that we designed our electoral system shapes the kinds of candidates that we get. So it's not just policy, it's candidates. And you would not end up with certain types of candidates who weren't able to speak to a broader coalition of people on both the left and the right. It looks very, we look very divided right now, but I think there are candidates in both parties who could speak a lot more effectively to a much broader swath of Americans if they had to, if that's what the rules require them to do.
I think that's an important part, because when you look at, for example, you've seen the conversation right now as the Democrats are going through their primary. And so you have a great pressure within that primary system right now between the more progressive candidates, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, and the more, quote, traditional Democrats, even folks like a Kamala Harris and a Pete Buttigieg to some extent, but certainly Joe Biden and Amy Klobuchar. So you have this sort of tension. And so one of the effects, I think, which I'm very curious about in terms of how it ultimately plays out, and I think it will play out this way, is our primary system will change too. Because our primaries right now are geared toward the lowest common denominator, because the parties know only this much of our entire voter pool is going to show up and vote. So you're driven by that energy. You're driven by those positions, right? That are, maybe anti-immigrant or wanting to take away private health care. And so you have this system in which everything is forced through this very, very narrow tunnel in a primary, And then you kind of open up into a general, and you see these candidates trying to, pivot and backstroke and swing and move to sort of deal with a broader electorate, which is now looking and focusing at looking at an election and going, "You gonna do what with my health care? And what did you say about immigrants?" And so it becomes something, I think, where a candidate now running for national office, and I think it'll be true for statewide offices as well, governors and other officials, will pay more attention to how they make that case. Because right now, our candidates make the case for Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and South Carolina, right? Under this system, they have to make the case for all other 46 states and let people know, yeah, I'm coming out to California next week, so I hear you. I'm going to be in Missouri after that. I'm going to be in Tennessee. And they become well-rounded. They become better versed. You're going to get a lot of bubble up from the state level of issues. So it's not just California sort of being the leading edge in policy and change at the state level. So I think overall it will refashion the way candidates not only behave in terms of getting votes, but how they behave in terms of addressing issues.
We're going to open it up to questions in about 5 minutes, so get your questions ready. But along those lines, I remember John McCain was basically a straight shooter with the media. At one point, he said ethanol is a joke, and that certainly didn't help him in Iowa. And then he kind of had to backtrack for that, and then actually finished fourth in Iowa, but that was at the beginning of his comeback. But it does show how that can affect policies of candidates. Jesse, you've studied this issue. You mentioned that backstage there was a vote in Congress many decades ago on this. Where do you see this movement? And give us a little history of it.
One of the things that's remarkable is we do think about this right now as a very partisan issue, right? Just as almost everything else in America. But it hasn't been. For most of American history, there's been no partisan valence to the question of how we should elect the president. It's actually had a remarkable level of support going all the way back to the Constitutional Convention. The most influential members of the convention in Philadelphia wanted a popular vote for president. Right, that's James Madison, James Wilson, Gouverneur Morris. These are the people who we generally identify with framing the essence of the Constitution. They wanted a popular vote. They couldn't get it. There's a lot of reasons for that, which I won't go into here, but including slavery, including the fight at the time between smaller states and bigger states, which wasn't as big a fight as you might think, but it was one. And then a few other concerns about what people could actually understand or know or learn about the candidates for national office. But going all the way through, up into what Bob was referring to is this effort in the 1960s, at the height of the civil rights movement. Most people don't remember that this happened, but there was a very concerted effort to abolish the Electoral College and replace it with the national popular vote starting in the mid-1960s. In 1969, the House of Representatives actually passed the bill to abolish the Electoral College overwhelmingly by something like 82%, so easily clearing the threshold for an amendment. It got to the Senate. It looked like they might have the votes in the Senate too. The states were clearly on board. I think it was something like 80% of the public at the time wanted a popular vote for president. This is 1968, 1969. It gets bottled up in the Senate. Do you know who bottles it up in the Senate? Strom Thurmond, Jim Eastland, Sam Ervin, the same people who were, filibustering the Civil Rights Act a few years earlier. They know where their bread is buttered. So they were blocking this. They blocked it until it died in the Senate, and it never went anywhere. But at that time, it had the support of Richard Nixon after he became elected president. It had the support of George H.W. Bush, who was then a congressman. It later had the support of Bob Dole. This was not a partisan issue because people fundamentally understood that majority rule was the essential foundation of democracy. And I think that it's unfortunate that all of the splits have gone in one direction, as I think Professor Wong pointed out in the last session, that it doesn't necessarily have to go that way, and we have seen Republican presidents as recently as George W. Bush winning by a substantial margin in the popular vote. Also, I think something like since 2002, which is only 17 years ago, 47 states have elected Republican governors. Republicans don't have trouble winning popular votes. I think it's a misunderstanding of how the incentive structures of our current system have warped the way campaigning happens and then led to the types of candidates that we have to make everybody think that somehow Republicans can't win a popular vote. I think that's actually a misunderstanding.
We will open up for questions. If you can raise your hand, and the mic will come to you. And if you can just keep your question short and identify yourself.
Hi, this is somewhat hypothetical, but given the current president's limited popularity in our country, if all of a sudden the popular vote went into effect for a 2020 election, do you think that there would be more interest from the Republican Party in considering alternative candidates?
Considering, what was the last part?
Alternative candidates.
Well, presumably by that point, the cutoff date under the compact would be July. So, if it happened right around that time, then pretty much your primary season is done, right? But if it happens before that, the remaining states coming into the pact, let's say, happen in February or March, during the legislative sessions. I don't know. I mean, you've got 3 candidates in there already. It certainly will change the dynamic of how they would run a little bit, given the window that they would have. I think, again, the question of how it would play out in a primary situation is a little bit grayer, I think, because you don't know how many candidates would get in, who would get out, how Donald Trump himself would articulate his campaign at that point. He has said that if there were a national popular vote in 2016, yes, I would have been in California. I would campaign differently. He recognizes the requirement that he would have to change out of the more traditional electoral college model into a national popular vote model in terms of a general election. What it would do in a primary, I think that would be a matter of timing of when the compact is fulfilled and the states are in. Later in the process, clearly won't have an impact on the primary. Early in the process, it probably could. But either way, I think Donald Trump would campaign differently regardless.
Hello, my name is Carol Baum. I'm wondering if you could say something about the strategy for achieving the enough states, and also what you see as the biggest obstacles to achieving the 270 electoral votes.
So I, in writing this book, I spent a good deal of time with the people involved in the compact effort, and they are a broad mix of Democrats and Republicans who have been doing this for over a decade, and they spend a huge amount of time going state to state and working with legislators, and if not convincing all of them, at least trying to reduce some of the knee-jerk opposition to the compact. They've actually passed in several houses. I can be corrected on this by there's some of their members are here today, but it's passed in at least one house in several Republican states, I think including Oklahoma. I'm trying to think of the others right now. Georgia, and one or two others. It's, there was a sense that before the split election in 2016, they were actually on the cusp of possibly getting it enacted in Georgia, in Utah, in Arizona, in states that were are trending purple, and their Republican leadership there seeing, if we don't do this now, we're suddenly going to be on the wrong side of winner-take-all rules. And so, convincing people in Republican-led states. I'm trying to avoid using red and blue because I think it's such a harmful way of conceiving of our country, as though like a state has only Republicans in it or only Democrats in it. It's purely an artifact of the winner-take-all rule, right? Like all states are purple states, but in states that have a majority of Republicans or Republican leadership, how do you convince them that this is a good thing? And I think part of it gets back to your question, which is this sense of, we're going to lose the popular vote, right? That's what everyone cares about in the end, right? People really just want the system that's going to win, that's going to help their candidate win. So if you can convince people that it's really up for grabs, if you go to a popular vote that it's really up for grabs, I think you can start to win over the Republican-controlled states, those last 74 electoral votes are I think, going to be a much, a heavier lift than the first 196. But I don't know if any of you have any other thoughts on how you convince right now in this moment, how you convince Republican lawmakers to adopt a compact that at least on the surface looks like something that would hurt them.
I think, at least in some of my conversations with folks, one of the things that folks are cognizant of is the demographic changes that are occurring. And, states that were, for example, comfortably red, use that term, certainly comfortably with, I guess, Republican control. Texas, demographically is changing. Republicans can't afford to lose Texas. Just can't. Not under this current system. It just, you lose Texas, there is no roadmap to 270. It just isn't. The math doesn't work. So all of a sudden you have to have a way to look at, okay, what's the alternative in terms of being competitive in a demographically changing environment? I've got to get my vote from someplace else. If my home is no longer the most reliable place to anchor my vote, and it's now been more competitive, and I've got to start building on these numbers, I've got to get outside the box. And that's what this forces you to do. You can't just stay in one place. You have to now look at a Michigan and a Missouri and a Washington State and Oregon and other places where your numbers may not be that strong, but the numbers enough there to add to what you're doing in Texas and what you're doing in Michigan and what you're doing in Ohio to sort of cobble together in a presidential race the kind of success you need. And I think a lot more and more Republicans are recognizing that, as you noted at the beginning of before the election turnout outcome of 2016, a lot of Republicans are like, yeah, I think we need to get ahead of this curve, right? Well, the curve's still there. You still got to go around the curve. I mean, I think what 16 did was just forestall the inevitable because the demographic changes are still happening. And states that were once reliably one party or the other are less so today.
Right, and Carol, to really also tackle your question, I think it's important to realize that in 2 of the past 5 presidential elections where we've seen this, there has been one party that has been successful. In 2000, Bush won, lost the popular vote. In 2016, Trump won, lost the popular vote. So I personally don't see this system really changing or a need until it really comes back and it's harmful. So you definitely see it becoming a politicized issue where Democrats have really lost this twice now and are, a little bit bitter, realizing that it's something that needs to change. And I think, you might have to have a loss like that on the other side to really push people to the national popular vote.
A couple more questions.
Hello, Jeffrey Jacobs at NPV Grassroots and at Time Horse. Thank you. And I'm wondering if we consider the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact a beta test before we do a constitutional amendment, would that be an easier path to pass a constitutional amendment?
No.
No. Yeah. Just real quick, the constitutional amendment process is messy. And I think given the political climate that we're in today, it would open up a lot of doors that we don't need to open and create a lot of distraction. What I love about this process is it is direct. It is going to the state legislatures. It is what our founding fathers intended us to do because they empowered those states individually to set the stage for how they want to elect a president. If my state decided in this upcoming session that in order to get the electoral votes for Maryland, you need to stand in the middle of the Annapolis Harbor and recite the Constitution, that's what you have to do. All right? That's what you have to do because that's what the state wants you to do. That's perfectly okay. So to be able to go in and negotiate and have this conversation directly with the states is cleaner, it's more direct, and it's no different than the states that decided we want to hold a lottery, Powerball. And we all entered into that compact together, and we abide by the rules that we set in place that, someone who plays in Maryland contributes to the winner in Oregon, and vice versa. So that to me is an arrangement among the states that's a lot cleaner, and I think it's consistent with what the founders intended.
I will give you one caveat, though. We are dangerously close to having a call for a constitutional convention. I am scared to death because we're not going to have a James Madison or a Ben Franklin. No. We're going to have a Sean Hannity or a Michael Moore, and God knows what violence they'll do to fundamentals of the Constitution. But if there were a constitutional convention, obviously that would be easier. You'd have to still get 3/4 of the states to go along with it, but you could put it out there in a way that would not be achievable otherwise. But pray that we don't have that venue.
And I just want to add to that question, this came up in the previous panel, but it's really important. I just want to reiterate it. The National Popular Vote Compact is using the Constitution as it was designed to be used. This is not, people, I heard on the last panel saying, let's do it the right way. I'm not sure what that means, the right way. Nobody's complaining that winner-take-all, statewide winner-take-all rules is not the right way, but states adopted those the same way that they would adopt the compact, which is we're deciding for ourselves how we're going to allocate our electors. And I think the other point that was made in the previous session was that this is how every major advance in the franchise in American history, or virtually every major advance, has happened, which is it happens at the state level first, right? Giving women the vote, giving poorer whites the vote, voting for the Senate, voting directly for senator. Yeah. All of these things bubbled up from the states and then became entrenched in the Constitution. But that's how it happens, and that seems like, to me, a fairly natural way for that to go.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that not every state is a winner-take-all state. There are 2 states that are not. They decided differently. So that, again, is consistent with our Constitution, and that is the right way for those 2 states to do it differently, and how they allocate their electoral votes for anyone who happens to win them. So this idea that there's a right way or a wrong way is inconsistent with what the founders had intended. The right way is the best way the states decide individually that they want to do this.
The one thing I would add to this is if we get close, and we finally are at that point, we're going to have to focus on making sure that there are not faithless electors. That, it's been a minor problem up till now. Every once in a while, you'll have somebody who is pledged to vote for the presidential candidate who won the state who doesn't do that. Many states have misdemeanor fines and the like, but you could see some mischief done. And we would hope that when we reach that point, states would pass implementing legislation as well that would ensure that when the state orders the electors to vote for the winner of the national popular vote, they actually do it.
Got a few minutes left. Let me get one more question in.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Oh, thank you very much. Pam Berg with the League of Women Voters. So I'm gonna ask this coming at it from a different angle and see if this is an option for the people that are perhaps emotionally attached to the Electoral College. What happens if we just get rid of winner take all and we tell, and the states adopt, hey, if it's 60% Republican, 40% Democratic, that's your electoral thing. And then if you can't reach the threshold, is the threshold of 270 in law? I mean, can we not change it? Is that just an alternative option? Thank you.
So that's a really good question. I think, again, as my co-panelists have been mentioning, that the Constitution, I believe it's Article 1, Section 2, Clause 1, gives the states the power to decide how the Electoral College is actually given per state. So you have 48 states that have decided on this winner-take-all system. 2 states have decided to award it some other way. So essentially, it would just be going back to the states, whether it's a national compact or some other way, to determine what is the best way, what is the most democratic process of awarding these electoral colleges, so that way our citizens living in the state have their voices heard. And 270 is just an important number. You will hear it road to 270, the map to 270. It's just the majority number.
There actually are several lawsuits underway right now to effectuate what you're asking for, which is basically to get the courts to rule that winner-take-all is a violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, as well as other, like First Amendment and a few other constitutional provisions. This actually happened, by the way, Delaware brought this lawsuit back in 1966 against New York, saying this isn't fair. You give all of your electors to one candidate or the other. You completely wipe us out. We don't count. You know, when New York has 20-something, 29 electors and Delaware has 3, Delaware doesn't matter. This is something else, right? The small states think they're being protected by the Electoral College using winner-take-all. The small states essentially don't matter. So that lawsuit and that idea that you're bringing up, it has been in the mix for a long time, for decades. The lawsuits right now were brought as part of a class action, 2 in Republican-led states and 2 in Democratic-led states. They're not making much progress. The Supreme Court threw out the 1966 lawsuit without even hearing it, so we don't actually know what the justices thought about it at the time. But that answers your question that this is an effort that's underway.
But there's an important caveat here. After Obama won, Pennsylvania, which of course at that point was quite democratic, had a Republican governor, a Republican legislature, the legislature in part because of the partisan gerrymandering. And they were making a move to change to an allocation by congressional district, which was a deeply gerrymandered congressional district model. And it was all to ensure that a Republican could win, even if the voters moved in a different direction. So if this happened in a few states, it actually could be a deeply distorted model. And I would be very, very cautious about moving in that direction.
And your question about proportional, whether everyone should just move to proportional voting, is an interesting one, and it's more complicated than it sounds, because if you can't divide electors into fractions, right, it could be a very skewed result itself. Right. Dividing electors into fractions requires a constitutional amendment also, which
right. And then you're getting into
and
rounding and all kinds of stuff. And again, I just go back to the founders, in their wisdom, however conceived, has put in place a system that we all understand the history and the purpose of the Electoral College. Then the question for us today is, how do we work within that framework, short of what you were saying, Norm, about a constitutional convention? And the states seemingly have worked out a way to do that. We will enter into bilateral, trilateral, multilateral relationships and agree this is how we intend to behave and to perform in an electoral process for the presidency. And I think that I'm much more willing to trust that than to throw it open to a national convention, get into proportionality and all these other things that I think the states themselves would have a hard time saying yes to.
But this might work the same way that the 17th Amendment did, which is it bubbles up from the states, and then you get a constitutional amendment. Right. And you can imagine, if we actually had the popular vote compact enacted, that you might see politicians saying, this is too complicated. A cleaner way for us, given that voters have expressed this will, is actually to have a constitutional amendment to create a national popular vote.
And I think it's worth mentioning, just to break it down, that the Electoral College was actually brought about because our founding fathers didn't trust everyday people, everyday citizens like you and me to vote for the president. So us considering what is the next step in our democracy is actually us actually claiming our voice and our right to vote and directly elect our president.
This was a fantastic discussion. Please thank our panelists for joining us, and I'll hand it back to Jim.